Hello, this is Steve Fretzin here with Tina Martini of DLA Piper, having a conversation about business development. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing very well, other than the dreary weather, which we're all dealing with. But listen, I wanted to, before we get into the nuts and bolts of business development, I was interested in hearing a little bit about your background and how you kind of came to be a top business developer.
Sure. So I've been at DLA Piper my whole career, which is 20 years. I came here right out of law school, and I actually started as a real estate lawyer at what was Rudnick and Wolf back then. Changed my practice to be an intellectual property attorney. Second year of my practice. So I've been practicing in intellectual property for about 19 years. My practice is primarily non-patent intellectual property. I do have a technical background, but decided that I wanted to pursue the non-patent side of things. So it's primarily trademarks, copyrights, unfair competition, a little bit of entertainment law, domain name, internet, marketing and advertising. There are all these different interrelated practice areas that sort of fall under the umbrella of intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing that for 19 years and have a full-time practice. We've got a group of about 25 professionals here in Chicago that I am the vice chair of this particular practice group in Chicago, and wear a number of different hats at the firm in addition to my full-time practice, which I'm happy to get into. But I think wearing those hats is actually a pretty important part of my development. I would say that being very involved in hiring and selling the firm to recruits.
Okay.
Actually, those skills, if I had to look back on when there was a big inflection point in my career in terms of sort of learning different skills beyond just being a great lawyer, I would say having to sell the firm to recruits, actually those skills translate very nicely into selling the firm to potential clients.
Right. You're trying to figure out, is there a good fit? Who's going to work within the culture, who's going to want to move their book up, all those kinds of things as a recruiter for the firm, and then you can translate that right in.
Exactly. Yeah, and how do you frame what the firm has to offer? How do you frame it for the different people who are listening? Because everybody comes from a different vantage point, and it's sort of speaking into their listening and just trying to figure out in the moment, okay, what is going to really move this needle forward with this particular person? What can I tell them about the firm that will mean something to them and will say, hey, I'm really interested.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So spin that into, when you did start deciding to build a book, or how did that come about where you started bringing in business and made that sort of a part of your daily or weekly kind of schedule?
Well, that's a great question. So I would say as a senior associate is when I really started thinking about my future and what it would entail and how would I ensure my own success. And being a great lawyer, I think, is the first thing you need to do, and oftentimes, you need to do that for purposes of getting work from people and so forth. But as I learned the ropes, became a great lawyer, started managing internal teams of, paralegals and staff as well as lawyers, and positioning myself so I became the day-to-day person. There were several relationships as I became more senior that I actually became sort of the relationship partner. And I think that's a really important part of business development, is realizing that keeping existing clients happy and trying to proliferate those relationships beyond just your own area is something that's very important. I started doing that as a senior associate. There were a number of folks who I worked with who were in-house counsel who ended up moving from certain clients that I worked to other companies. And because of my relationships with them and the fact that I did good work for them and they knew they could trust me, then we started doing work for those new companies that we hadn't previously done by virtue of the fact that these folks that we had known at these other clients made the move. So those I think were some of the initial steps I took from a business development perspective.
So were you managing other partners' relationships that then became your own?
Yes.
But you stayed with those relationships, and when they changed companies, you were the person that they called immediately.
Yes.
Okay.
And it isn't necessarily you're going to get business from the person you know, but you're often going to get business from the person or people that they know. And I've been the beneficiary of that too. So the moral of the story is keep in touch with the people you know. I would say look to trade associations early in your career as being a potential source of business. ABA, CBA, ISBA, all of those are really good ways to meet people too. But be very strategic and think about who who are the people who are going to be there? Who do you want to meet, and how many other competitors of yours are going to be there? Because if you're going to be, one of many outside counsel for like maybe only a handful of in-house attorneys, everybody's thinking the same thing you are. So try to think outside the box about joining organizations, being on the board of different institutions where you're likely to meet people that could be sources of business.
Okay, but I want to hit on that, but I want to go back for a second. So,
okay, sure.
I go back to the idea that everyone has relationships. Everyone has friends from college and law school and neighbors and et cetera, et cetera. I think the biggest problem that some of the less experienced attorneys have relates to they don't want to come across like they're there pitching or that they have to, that they're leveraging some relationship to get something. How do you suggest they develop the relationship where business can be talked about without being maybe seen as a salesperson or pushy or kind of annoying to their friend that they've known for 10 years or whatever it might be?
That's a great question. I would say it has to be a much more organic process. It's about developing the relationship. A lot of marketing publications and people who are in the field say you have to go through a multitude of touch points in getting to know somebody. Some people say it's as many as 9 or 10 before you're reasonably positioned to ask for business. One thing that I've done is really, I think to me it's a very selfless process. You get to know somebody because you genuinely like them. There has to be some sort of rapport in order for you to be able to spend the kind of time you need to spend with them sometimes in order to get to the place where you're comfortable making the ask. What I usually do is as I'm getting to know somebody, I listen. As we discussed a couple minutes ago, listening is a really important part of it. Also, it's the power of asking the right questions.
Okay.
So as part of the getting to know you process and asking the questions like, so what is your job? How do you like it? What sorts of things do you work on? What are your likes and dislikes? You start getting answers to some of the questions you may have. And what I've done is I've just been very generous with my advice. What I try to become is the trusted advisor. And I know that that's a phrase that's used a lot as well, but I really try to carefully listen to what is working for these folks, how they tick, what they're looking for in outside counsel, and what they may not be getting currently. And I try to think of ways that I can spend my time giving them advice, whether it's in my subject area or looping in one of my colleagues down the hall, to try to just be the sounding board without necessarily asking for anything in return. Okay. And I've just noticed that actually can end up paying dividends in the long run, because people remember that, especially if you're not sticking your hand out asking for something right away.
Right, but I think what you're getting towards is really important for people to hear, and that is you're not sticking your hand out. You're asking questions. Maybe these questions are leading to potential fears that the person you're talking to might have, or potential risk that they have regarding maybe your trademark. So, my mark is at risk, my copyright's at risk, whatever it might be, and you're asking questions to divulge that. And then maybe walking them through, well, you just want to be, listen, I don't know if you're interested in my advice, but, here's a concern I have. And they, oh my God, I didn't even think of that. And now all of a sudden you're having a business conversation because you asked enough questions to sort of know that there's something to talk about. Right?
Exactly.
Now, the other thing I wanted to bring back is you mentioned getting involved in trade associations and finding kind of a niche where you could be. I mean, how does someone who feels like all the niches are taken, or all this is, there's already going to be 100 attorneys there. Where, how could I fit in? I'm one of 50,000 in the city, or whatever it is. How do they find what they're looking for? How do they find, a group that they could belong in?
Well, I think that's a great question. I would say you have to sort of look at where you are in your practice right now and think about if there are certain things that you would like to do differently. And I think this is particularly true for, and associates can do this too, but I think that associates who are at least several years into their career, because I think that's when they get the clarity about potential niches within their practice area and so forth. But you need to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, the types of people that you would tend to get along with, where your practice is headed, where it is right now, because then that will help you sort of figure out what is the right trade association for me. Because, and you can start kind of broadly. You may want to sort of get your feet wet with the ABA, the ISBA, the CBA, but yeah. I would suggest looking to get involved in trade associations where there aren't necessarily a ton of lawyers there. For example, I have an engineering background. I have, several folks in my network who are plugged into entrepreneurial trade associations where a lot of what these folks are developing is sort of emerging growth technology, that sort of thing, which totally plays into my sweet spot. There are in-house counsel trade associations like the Association of Corporate Counsel, for example, where we have access to them because the firm is a sponsor of that organization. I mean, those sorts of organizations are really very valuable, and they can be very helpful in terms of making connections to people.
Okay. So any final words or thoughts relating to business development and, again, thinking about someone in your firm that maybe is 5 years in, 6 years in, doesn't have a book, is doing everyone else's work, and you could just see the potential in this young man or young lady, and you want to give them one thing to think about, what would that be?
I would say, and this is separate and apart from what we've discussed,
okay,
but I think it's an important point. When you're in a general practice firm in particular, it's really important to not only know what you can sell yourself personally as well as people in your practice group. You really need to know what your colleagues down the hall do that are not in your practice area. Because part of being an effective rainmaker is not only being a great lawyer and being able to sell your services and being able to sell the services of people in your practice area, but also knowing your colleagues well enough and the nuances of their practice well enough that when you're sitting, breaking bread with a potential client or an existing client and you're listening to what they're saying, you know enough about what your firm's capabilities are and what your colleagues' capabilities are that you can issue spot. Because that, especially in this kind of an environment, is just as important as being able to sell yourself, is being able to know when you hear that there's an opportunity outside of your practice.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize the power of that. You're doing $25,000 or $50,000 in intellectual property work for a company. You ask a few extra questions, the next thing you know, there's a major litigation opportunity that you hand off to your partners, and it's $1 million. You get origination on that. This was your client that you brought in.
Exactly.
And if you have the relationships with the best litigators at your firm and the best other people in other areas, and you know enough to ask questions, I mean, that can make your year. And who's doing the work? Not you.
Right.
So
exactly.
there's a lot of benefit to that. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think people, we just talked about all this about staying focused and staying focused, but yet you do need to know, in particular in a full service firm, what everyone else does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also knowing the personalities, because again, sort of looping back to a concept we talked about earlier, clients are looking for more than just people who are great practitioners who may be the best of the best. They also, especially if there's a certain vibe or personality within a law department at a company, they have sort of a groove, they've got a cadence to how they do things, and they need their outside counsel. There needs to be a meeting of the minds, not only in terms of understanding the substance of the legal area, but also similar working styles and so forth. And you need to know your colleagues well enough to know, from a personality standpoint, are these people likely to click or are they not going to click? Because that can make a huge difference too. Yeah.
You bring in a very aggressive, type of partner, and you've got a very kind of soft-spoken, humble type of client, and they don't
clash.
They can clash in there, and you've kind of shot yourself in the foot on that.
Exactly.
So I think you're right. I think it's important to know both sides of it. That's great. So listen, I just want to thank you for your time. This is some great information. I'm excited to blog this and get it out there to the public. A lot of attorneys, I think, are hungry for this information. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.